Well, we will go ahead and get started. The council president is on her way. So let's go ahead and call to order. Clerk, we call the roll?
Agent.
Here.
Clegg. Halliburton.
Here.
Sanchez.
Here.
Willits. Here. Whittings.
Here.
5 present, 1 absent.
Thank you. First up, we've got, saw Tim Keene. Are Bree and Karen also part of this? Welcome. To discuss the micromobility plan for the city. Welcome.
Mayor, members of council, thank you. I'll very briefly just give you an update on where we stand with micromobility. As we're in a period of transition right now, so wanted to make sure you all knew that and knew what's coming next. Of course, you've recently taken some action that's part of this process that we're in the midst of right now, and I'll mention that in just a moment. I guess the context I'll provide before I dig into a little bit of detail in the next 2 slides is that Boise, like all cities, was the micromobility and scooters was thrust upon Boise fairly quickly. And in response to the introduction of these new devices into our community, the reaction was at the time, which made sense and was a similar reaction in a lot of places, that we would regulate these private companies through agreements that we ultimately, we had to create an ordinance related to how we regulate them, and then agreements that we would enter into with the companies to operate within the city. So essentially, it's somewhat of a kind of regulatory role that the city was playing. And what we're proposing at this time is to shift to, I would call it more of a partnership arrangement with a single provider. As you know, we have 3 companies working in the city today. And the process we're in the midst of is to shift to the selection of an individual vendor who would operate in the city in some kind of relationship with us, such that we think we'll have a much better control over the outcomes that we get by a company operating these devices in the city kind of for us. So where we are in terms of the process is that you had recently approved some legislation that would allow us to extend a couple of the vendors' licenses of another number of months, because the way we had it, we had 2 vendors whose agreements were expiring in October, and then we had 1 vendor whose agreement was expiring in March. So we wanted all of those vendors to continue to just operate until the same time. So we extended the 2 operators' licenses until the spring of next year. So we've done that. So those agreements and renewal of licenses is in progress now with Lime and Bird. We're working on, among a group of staff, a request for proposals that will go out very early in November. And we've been looking at lots of other cities and talking through all the kinds of issues that we would want, to be represented in any kind of sound proposal to us. Of course, the companies are very used to this. There's other cities that have done the same thing. So this is a process that everybody has experienced, and it's been approached in different ways in different cities, but a lot of the outcomes have been similar that cities have been seeking. We're working on that proposal, and it will go out soon, with the goal being that we would choose a single vendor at the very beginning of next year in January, so we could start working with them on the launch of this new service. As you can imagine, that's going to be an interesting discussion around all the things that we hope to achieve as a city when it comes to the availability of micro devices to support mobility around the city. Then we would, after discussing that with them and having selected a vendor, having discussed how we work together on introduction of this new service, we would come back to you with a resolution to city council. We're targeting April of next year such that we could be prepared for a May launch of the new system next year with the single provider. So then some key issues to address. Obviously, we've got the e-scooters, but also e-bikes. And, there's different issues associated with that. The companies aren't as interested in e-bikes. We have a pilot e-bike program going on right now in the city, as you know, through VRT. So we've started discussions with VRT about what the implications of that are relative to where we're headed, because we certainly do want us all working together. And I mentioned here in one of the bullets, Boise State University, which had gone through a process of their own to select a vendor on the campus. So they have a separate agreement right now with an individual vendor for the Boise State campus. We want to integrate them into this as well. So we don't have multiple agencies with separate contracts with vendors. We have one overall system that we're all jointly working together on, such that we can really work on issues like are in some of these bullets, the deployment of devices beyond just downtown to locations where we think it would be helpful relative to access to transit, or certainly there's kind of equity issues here, both in the geographic deployment of the devices, but also just in the, as you can see on the bottom, just the what are the steps that we need to take to make sure that there's affordable rides available to people, and there's different ways to approach that. So that'll certainly be among the things that we're going to want the vendors to address in any kind of proposal to us. So in this list, what you're seeing here are issues that we're working on, but also things that will certainly be included as among the things that we want the vendors to speak to in the proposals that they'll be submitting to us. So that is a quick update on where we are. I'm excited about this. I think it's a good next step in terms of the evolution of this of micromobility in Boise, and is going to present a lot of opportunities for us as a community. And the big issue is, rather than just regulating them, let's work with someone to actually try to address issues that we would like addressed, whether it's the affordability issue or the geographic distribution or other issues around how we deal with safety and just the deployment of the devices around the city. When we're in a regulatory mode, we have less kind of control over that. We feel like it'll be better for us to be working in partnership towards achieving the things that better the city in the process of them operating their business. So.
Feedback?
Madam Mayor. Madam Mayor.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Tim. So I have some questions that a constituent wanted me to ask. So if it's all right with you, I'll make it quick. So this is somebody who is very avid user of our pathways, bicycles, uses the bus system. She has a question about, she said she recalls that we used to have a bicycle advisory committee, and she's wondering if we still have that, and if not, are we considering putting an advisory committee that perhaps would include all these other options that we have for micromobility in addition to bicycles?
Yes, council member, thank you. That is true. That the city used to have, I think it was the Bike and Pedestrian Advisory Committee that is no longer operating. We are discussing the recreation of such a committee in association with and I've recently written you about the mobility and public spaces team within planning, which is going to give us a lot more capacity to not only regulate, but also lead on issues related to this. And so in association with we're hiring a director right now and building out that team. We have been discussing that very thing, council member, the recreation of a committee that could provide advice and counsel on all these issues, including this one.
Great. Just to follow up, Madam Mayor, the other question that she's posing is about the use of the Greenbelt. As we all know, we have had an influx of new Boiseans to the area. And she's concerned with the fact that we have new people using this vital resource that we have, and that we, of course, want people using, but that there may be newcomers who don't know the rules, don't know the language to preserve safety. In addition, we have the e-bikes that, as we know, move faster than a pedal-powered bicycle. And so she's wondering if we're going to be doing anything to address, the etiquette and the education of folks as we have more folks using that path and other pathways as well.
Thank you, council member. And really that's among the reasons, and I should have had it on my bullets here, that we felt like it would be better to go to a partnership with an individual vendor, which is one of the issues will be, education and communication around protocols, sometimes rules, not just protocols, but both rules and protocols around how to operate devices, how to follow the rules, but also how to be a good neighbor, so to speak, in terms of how we utilize public spaces in the city. So that will be among the things. We feel like we'll have a much more capacity to do that when we're kind of in partnership with a single vendor, because one of our standards, one of the goals we'll have is that very thing, that we're using our spaces in ways that don't conflict with others that are using those spaces, like the Greenbelt. There's
We've got-
also some other
Tim.
kind of technological things we can do to address issues like speed in some cases, potentially.
Council President and then Councilmember Willetts.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Tim, couple of questions. One, I guess at the heart of it, this essentially will be a new policy for how we're going to handle e-bikes and e-scooters. And the RFP will reflect that. So what role do you see for council in developing the scope for the RFP?
I would say, actually, I think that the more appropriate question is not the RFP, but the policy, because it's actually two different things. The policy would be contained within the RFP. So if you have suggestions as a council president for the role that you'd like to see council play in that, we're happy to hear that, as well as perhaps hear from Bree or Tim for feedback. But there's more than the policy in an RFP.
Oh, certainly. And I that's exactly what I was trying to say. But the RFP should reflect whatever policy we decide we want to see going forward. And that really is a policy decision. And rather than rely on staff to understand what policy we'd like to see, I would like to see some process for us to give direction on that as you write the RFP. Does that make sense?
It does. And we have been discussing, clearly there'd be action by council associated with this before we have a vendor, before we've been through the RFP process, that there would be action of council to enable where we're headed with this, because we have a code now, which was drafted under very different circumstances, so that we would be coming to you for that. So yeah, we'll provide that specificity, council member.
Great, thank you. And then the second question is sort of related. Other places that originally pursued a bike share system have evolved into a contract with their bike share provider, but it still covers many of the same kinds of provisions that the bike share system originally did, with the addition of equity and some of those other things. Are we envisioning something like that, or much more hands-off, you private provider do all of that?
No, we see this as I said, as a partnership, not as just an arm's distance. We're regulating you based on this agreement we have. We see it as a pretty close partnership, akin to what you were describing in other cities.
One follow-up, if I could, and within that, then, do you see room for localized branding of this?
Yeah, that's an interesting part of it, in the context, yes, localized branding, even questions about, depending on what kind of public benefits we're expecting of this, where does that take us in terms of sponsorships and things like this, in association with, even when a private vendor is operating the system, that in cities in the Northwest, where you to achieve the goals that you have for the public, that it helps to have some private sponsorship so that you can get fares down, so that you can get perhaps deployment in places that don't in and of themselves generate revenue. We got to work through those things.
Thank you. I thought that that was where we were headed, and those are some of the concerns I've heard from people. So I just wanted to make sure we got that on the record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Tim, thanks for the presentation and the work of your team. It's exciting. It's important. I've used these in other cities. And so I think it's part of what we need to do in the city of Boise. I'm interested in why we want to do one vendor. You've mentioned some of the benefits. I'd like to dig in a little bit more on the purpose of having one vendor, and then if there's been other cities that have done one vendor and why that is, and educate us on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think, cities are really moving to this way of doing it. And some have taken that step quite some time ago. But it was very common initially for cities to be in that regulatory mindset like we were in. But after experiencing the situation for some time, most cities are headed this way. The question is the degree to which there's kind of a private sponsorship of the system, or not. That's the big difference. Single vendor in all those circumstances, because that's the best way to provide the service, is to have one vendor. Think about one vendor in the context of the various devices that we might have. So the scooters, the e-bikes, and so forth, but also just integration with other mobility options that people have in the city, whether it's the bus or even parking and things like this, that there's a really integrated system with one micro mobility provider. Those are among the things that this affords us. But the question is, again, I think the big threshold question is, what are the things that we really want to go further on as a city that might justify some kind of private sponsorship in addition to the individual business vendor running the devices and the system. Does that make sense, council member?
Yeah, I was wondering if it had to do with logistics too, because you have lots of different modalities, and then how do you ensure that you got the right place to deposit them? I wondered if logistics was part of it
there are
as well.
logistics. You're right. There are definitely logistical issues here when you got multiple vendors operating and and all the devices, managing the devices, maintenance of the devices, keeping the devices off, out of places where you don't want them. And we all know everybody struggles with this. This isn't unique to Boise. But again, when you got three vendors that are basically just following some rules you have, that's very different than if you have someone that is, in partnership with you to provide the service. So.
Thank you.
Can you give an example of a place where there's the single vendor and then the city has decided to have a private sponsorship beyond the company that's doing providing the machines?
Yeah, Portland would be an example of that. Where
and so what's the benefit of that? Is it additional funds that allow you to do more? Like, I don't.
Exactly. That's what it is, man.
So it's like, say it's Lyft, but sponsored by Blue Cross or sponsored by, that's how it works?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you put out an RFP for both?
Well, it wouldn't be an RFP for the sponsor, probably. It would be us seeking a sponsor. We'd have to fundraise essentially to find a sponsor. And there's potential around that, of course, but you described it well. So if, all of these are companies seeking to make money. So they're bidding on the opportunity to provide this service in the city. They're not thinking, I'm going to deploy in a place with relatively few rides where we feel like it's important to have those devices.
Oh, that's where the sponsorship matters, is so that we can get them
bigger
in
reach
places where they wouldn't necessarily be planning to put them.
Right.
So when we were on council and we created the ordinance, we wanted to see scooters all over the place, but we didn't really see the scooters all over the place.
Right.
And so this would help us cover sponsorship would potentially help us cover the cost of actually getting them all over the place.
Right. Exactly. So there's
Okay.
two things. There's that, the coverage, so we could get better coverage. If we as a city feel like it's important to touch more places, then okay, that helps with that. And then the second thing is just the rate, what you're paying. As you take a ride on a scooter right now, it can cost you a fair amount depending on where you're going. Can we get these prices down, especially for specific constituencies, but maybe overall get the prices down some? That's just something we'll have to work through. But it's yes, Mayor, the coverage and then the rate to try to make it more affordable.
And does
Which-
this also then, just getting back to Councilmember Willard's question on logistics, does this create the potential then to even target that? So like that last mile off of bus routes,
Exactly.
are you able to negotiate that we want coverage in specific places or rates at reduce in specific places to kind of hit our ideal coverage areas
That's
versus
right.
like the fun downtown late at night? But instead our priority, like we want that and we want last mile off the bus route off Fairview.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Madam Mayor. Thank you, Tim. So I guess a comment and then a question. So you know that I love e-bikes a lot. We have had this conversation before. And so I was excited when we ended up with an e-bike pilot downtown, but it hasn't been working that great. And here's why. Because you have to use a dock. And the docks are so far apart that it's like, well, I could grab an e-bike for my meeting at Idaho Power, but like the dock is a few blocks away and I'm going to have to pay an extra couple of bucks to just lock it to whatever bike rack I want. So I haven't been using it very often. So as we're going about this, I think that that's really important to take into account is how are we keeping it convenient for people so that they actually use them in places like downtown where you're not necessarily going a half mile, you're going a few blocks and you're using it for like speed and efficiency instead of like, longer distance transportation. So that's kind of comment number one and my ongoing frustration with the e-bike pilot downtown. And then number two is I had the opportunity this summer to visit many cities with many different models of bike share, of scooters, of e-bikes, places where they only have regular bikes and very few e-bikes, places where they have multi-modes of micromobility. And I'm just curious, like, how did you land on this one? What makes this one the best model for Boise? And what were the other models that maybe you explored?
Well, I think some of what you're describing is to be worked out, in negotiation with a successful vendor that submits, because it doesn't necessarily have to do with whether it's one vendor or multiple vendors. So what we think we feel strongly about is in cities that have successful programs, there's one vendor providing service. And in some cases, that's things like Divvy in Chicago, which has one vendor, but it's a little bit different than what I'm talking about, but it's a single vendor. So the thing that we think is consistent across cities where it's being done successfully is that there's a single vendor that somehow is working with the city, number one. But then to your point about the different types of devices and dockless versus dock and all those kinds of things, that is something for us to work with them on to determine what's the best, approach here in Boise. So we'll have more discussion about that.
Great.
The one other thing I'd say about your comments is I don't think the VRT e-bike system is entirely dock based. I know they're at the docks, but they don't require the docks.
It charged me $2
to not park it.
to lock it out of
Okay.
system.
Okay. So
So-
you're penalized for not doing that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Madam Mayor.
Mhm.
Tim, I just maybe want to put a finer point on the regulatory versus partner. So as a regulatory agency, when we have 3 different vendors out there, there's no real incentives for them to do a wonderful and beautiful job. And sometimes you have scooters that are blocking things, that are creating accessibility issues, and that frankly, when they're lying on the ground all over the place, kind of look like garbage. And we get a lot of complaints about that. But what our hope is, and let me know if I'm right, is that by going with one vendor, we're having one partner that we'll have to communicate with instead of three if we're disappointed in how things are being done. But they're also coming to us with an agreement that they're going to be better at these issues than we're getting right now.
You've described it well, council member. Yes, that's true. Mhm.
Yeah, because that really is one of the number one complaints that we get, is how bad they look when they're laying on the ground, or, blocking somebody, especially somebody who has accessibility issues when they're trying to get somewhere.
Absolutely.
And they've got a scooter that's locked up and difficult to move. My other kind of question is do you think that within the RFP, do you think that we'll be able to get access to any of their data? Is that something that we're seeing in any other cities? Because that's one thing that would be really nice to be able to use.
I'm glad you brought that up, council member, because that's another benefit of this approach, is that in the agreement that we're getting data from the company that we're in partnership with that can be helpful to us in other ways. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great, because I think that one of the things that we're trying to figure out is like, how are these being used? What paths are people taking? Are they reducing single occupancy vehicle traffic? Are people actually using them for transportation? And are they being used in an equitable way? When we move them into different areas of town and seeing that use. And so that data, I think, is really, really great to have. So thank you.
Madam Mayor, I have kind of a follow-up onto the technology question. So one thing that I've noticed in other places is that, like, for example, in San Francisco, when you rent a bike, you can rent it on the Lyft app. You can use their transit app, or you have one other option, I believe. What kind of technology can we expect to have deployed to make it a little bit more accessible and maybe a little bit easier to access for folks?
Council member, that's the reason I mentioned that was one of the benefits of having a single vendor, is that we can integrate access to micromobility with other mobility options that they have, transit being the most important one. But there may be other aspects that we've got to integrate into one system for people to access this service. And so among the things that will be in the RFP is that very thing. We've got to have a technology that's integrated across agencies here. So you go one place for that service. That's the goal.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Madam Mayor. Tim, one of the hesitations that some of us had when scooters were first proposed a few years ago was safety. And I really don't know if we have any record of how safe these have been, but I'm wondering if we do move forward and we end up seeking a sponsor, to also, and I also appreciate you mentioning the equity in terms of folks being able to afford this. And folks who actually need it, and it's not for recreation, but it's for transportation. I'm wondering if it's a possibility for there also to be sponsorship of helmets for safety, that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, that looks like it for now. So am I correct in that this will come back for another work session with some updates based on the conversation? Other questions related to policy that staff needs guidance on in advance of putting together the final RFP?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Mayor?
Yes.
So it seems like we'll have to repeal the existing ordinance and insert a new ordinance for micromobility. Is that kind of how it's going to roll out?
That's correct.
Okay.
By the time we launch. But we're going to come to you before then, as the mayor was saying, to go through some of these issues we've been discussing tonight as we craft them for the RFP.
Okay, so the RFP comes first and then ordinance change comes second.
Yes.
Excellent.
Policy discussion before.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, the work session will bring the stuff we reviewed, anything that came up today, and questions from staff related to policies and desires. So information, kind of data, as you mentioned, or whatever else it is that you want to see in that RFP. Okay. And then Bree, you don't have to come up here, but did you have something else to say? I can repeat it in the mic. Were you able to get that? Okay, just for the record then, Bree Brush from my office said they'd be back likely in 2 weeks with follow-up that would include discussion of policies, RFP, the potential new ordinance for review, dates and next steps. Great, thank you. All right, and now we are going to cover our extended parking prohibition ordinance review. Is this the 6-month or 1 year mark?
Madam Mayor, we're a little bit beyond the 6 month. We're about 18 months past. So
Oh my
this
goodness,
is
time is just, okay. It's been
time
a
is
time warp.
flown very quickly.
And this is timely because there have been quite a few questions of late as to how it's working, if some of the times and deadlines should change. And so I was glad to know and to let some members of the public know that we are working on this today.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, council members. I'm Tyler Johnson with the Code Compliance and Community Resources team. I'm here today to talk to you about the extended parking program. And just to go over kind of the format for today's discussion, I'll go over the background of the ordinance, give you an update on how the changes to that ordinance have been going, and then queue up a discussion as requested to let you guys kind of weigh in and maybe give some direction on some potential tweaks to this to see if we can make it a little bit better in the future. The background on this is that on-street parking is a shared resource for everybody. What the parking compliance team does, it's not just about writing tickets to cars downtown. It's actually to promote turnover. So in the downtown core, obviously we use parking meters to promote that churn, make sure we have short-term parking available for businesses. Move out a little bit further and you have time zones that we also enforce. And then the rest of the city is covered by what I call the blanket rule of the 72-hour parking. And this is the ordinance that we're talking about today. Basically, a vehicle can only remain on the street in one place for 72 hours, and then it has to move on to another location. We get a lot of complaints about this. The numbers I have at the bottom here, this is just people that have filled out the online parking compliance request. In addition to these numbers, police gets many, many calls. We get other calls and emails. And I posted a couple of kind of just random ones that I pulled out of here that were just to kind of give you a flavor of the different complaints that we get. Basically, we get a lot of calls for service asking for this vehicle's been parked in front of my house. This trailer's been parked at this intersection. It's definitely one of our, and you can see the numbers have actually increased over the years. I don't know if that's a changing of actual violations or just a changing perception, or if it's easier to get to us through that complaint form, but we definitely receive a lot of complaints about this. Last year in April, we added a qualifier to this ordinance. Basically, this was not in here before, but we put the vehicle must move 600 feet or more because we were getting a lot of vehicles that would be marked. They'd move a couple feet up or down the block just to avoid getting a parking ticket or avoid being towed. We also work very closely with the Boise Police Department's abandoned vehicle team, which used to be in DFA, but was moved over to BPD last August. We still work very closely with that team as well as the neighborhood contact officers. But those are the two changes that we made last year. And then the numbers I pulled down below, just 3 snapshots, same time frame as those complaints you saw on the last slide. But you can see the number of these parking tickets, pretty static over the years. There was an increase from the 19 to 20, and then a slight decrease the year after we implemented that. That just means we didn't see an increase in parking tickets issued because of this code change, but this is just kind of give you an idea of how many tickets were issued.
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
On this, can I jump in? 2 things. First, I'm pleased and surprised that we changed the code and issued fewer tickets. That's good. But we also have a lot more contacts. So can we infer that there's a lot more of officers talking to people, educating people, interacting with the public about this, even though we're not using the more heavy-handed enforcement of tickets? Is that the right way to interpret this data?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Bajent, that's very true. We probably have a lot more discussions about this code now. We get a lot of people that call in, hey, my tire got marked. Hey, I got this orange notice from abandoned vehicles on my vehicle. What can I do? So I think that could probably be a factor of why that number did go down slightly in that year.
Great, thank you.
So just a really quick case example. This is just one that I pulled randomly out of our system. Vehicle impound unit, which I've referred to as the abandoned vehicle program. They've received multiple complaints about this same vehicle. Complaint was basically, there's an abandoned car on the street, no license plates, been sitting here for weeks. So the abandoned vehicle officer from BPD went out 6 separate times to mark the vehicle and noticed each time that the notice was being removed and the vehicle would move a little bit up and down the block. So because of the 600-foot rule, they ultimately did issue 2 parking tickets. Both tickets have been paid. The vehicle now has license plates on, and the vehicle is now being used more frequently. So in this specific instance, we did gain compliance by having those parking tickets available, whereas before, moving a little bit resets the time, if you will, whereas the 600-foot rule basically says, you have to leave access equal to everyone else to park on the street. So that's where we're seeing a little bit of compliance gained with this education. So in summary, the change that we made last year did give us an additional tool to help gain compliance. It does help address some citizen complaints and in many situations without towing. That Mercedes in the last slide was a great example of someone who never got their vehicle towed, which is a positive situation. It can also help make those contacts, educate people on what they can do to find other solutions for storing their vehicles. Sometimes people buy recreational vehicles, utility trailers, things like that don't have a place to store them and think they can just park them on the street. So sometimes a parking ticket is a good way for our team to actually make contact with the vehicle owner and see if we can get them to move it into their backyard, find a storage location for it. So with that, that's kind of my presentation, hoping to spark a little bit of conversation with you guys, answer any questions you have, and see if we can come up with any tweaks to get this program a little bit better from where we have it today.
Madam Mayor, I've heard anecdotally from the public that at least some people feel the 600-foot distance is not far enough, and the constituent feedback that I've gotten is there are some areas of town where abandoned or long-term vehicles are a problem, and those areas are bigger than 600 feet. And so people are shuffling within that area. And the feedback from the constituents is it would be really great if that distance were increased so that at least some of the time I could have access to the space in front of my business or in front of my home. And I've certainly gotten that feedback, but I wonder if you have any feedback or information on point from the city or from BPD or from other people apart from just, a certain number of concerned constituents.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Council Member, this is, like I said before, we definitely get a lot of complaints about this. There are specific pockets of the city where we get vehicles being stored on the street weeks on end. They're aware of the rules and the distance. In some of these like quasi-industrial areas, a vehicle can move and stay on the same block, move 600 feet and move 600 feet. They're really, the spirit of the law is that vehicles cannot be stored on the street. So increasing the distance could definitely help gain compliance and getting the vehicle owner to find another place to store that vehicle or move to another part of town and not be clogging up one part of the town and causing other issues. Because we have some of these vehicles cause trash and needles and things like that around them. And there's obviously more reasons behind that, but increasing that distance could help move that problem to another location or help it from not occurring because they're not staying in that location for a much longer period of time.
Thank you.
Sorry, we had come for the pledge and then let's.
Thank you. I guess absent trying to increase the distance and essentially focusing on this as the regulation, what other regulations can we use? If the problem is really related to specific vehicles and the activities around those specific vehicles, rather than further regulating where you park on the street, is there a different tack that we could take? Have you thought about that? And I'm thinking about neighborhoods where frankly, people don't have anywhere else to park except on the street in front of their house. And we're telling them that we want them to drive their car all the time. Yeah, so there's a bit of a disconnect.
Madam Mayor, Council President, what I would like to do going forward is probably do some research, and actually the NCO team at BPD has been already doing a lot of research on other cities and what's out there. The reason I haven't really presented any larger options at this meeting is because I want to basically say, hey, we made a change last year. Let's check in on that, see how it's going. And if it's the desire of the council, I think we could probably take another whack at this code section. I've heard different ideas, maybe different zoning of different parts of town have different rules. That could be fraught with other issues, but there's definitely other options out there. I think we could also look at, is 72 hours the right time frame? Maybe that's shortened up. But there's definitely other solutions out there. We could do some research and come back with some recommendations to update that code to see if we could get better compliance.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler. This is really helpful. And I think particularly the trajectory is helpful as well. I want to add my voice to what the council president said and what council member Bajent said. I think we need to look at the time, not only the hours but also the feet, because I think one of the things that I've been concerned about is basically people who are camping in their cars and in their RVs. And anecdotally, it seems like there's a circuit. So folks they know the rules. So they go to this part of town and then they go back to this part of town and they're obeying the rules, but it's having effect on the businesses. It's unsightly. There's things that none of us would want to see. And so I'm wondering, as we think about the ordinance, how we can address that specifically so that we can make sure that we're not having an adverse effect on businesses at the same time.
Madam Mayor, council member, I think that's great points. I think there's definitely some more work we could do on this, and maybe take some of those populations and point them in directions. If they're continuing to maybe get parking tickets, maybe that would help them go seek other services that would potentially get them out of those situations. So I think there's some stuff we could do that would definitely get us into a better position here.
Madam Mayor, thank you for the presentation. I guess I'm going to go the other way with that. I had a constituent reach out to me complaining about an RV parked in the residential area. And, I let him know that they could file a complaint. I said, or you could go knock on the door and see if they need any help. That's another approach. We could tap into this Boise kindness that we talk about so much. I know that, we're not wearing masks anymore. A lot of us have our shots, and it looks like we've moved on from COVID, but the reality is it's still here. There are still people getting sick, and they are finding all kinds of ways to get through it. And I know personally somebody who used an RV to be able to care for their loved one, and there was no place on the property for them to park the RV. And so my concern is that we are falling in love with the regulation, and we are not being compassionate in terms of people trying to survive the situation that we are still in. And I think if we're going to be pressing hard on the regulation part, I would like to see an equal attempt to make sure that we have an alternative for folks. So it does concern me that we are trying to press the gas on that when people are still suffering. So that's something I have an issue with.
Madam Mayor, I think that Councilmember Sanchez is right, but we should also recognize that the data shows that in this post-COVID time, with this increased regulation, we're writing fewer tickets. And to me, that says the officers are doing that work, that they are being compassionate, and that they are working with people on the street to suss out what the situation is and act appropriately. So the regulation, the evidence we saw indicates that the regulation is not being used in a heavy-handed way or coming down on people, even at a time when we have more people in the situations that the council member described. It's absolutely important that we keep an eye on that because she's exactly right. You don't want to create a bunch of rules that just punish people for being in bad circumstances. I'm curious to know whether we have ever In my mind, Tyler, you're the parking guru, and that might be really unfair. So you can say, I don't know, and that's okay. But whether we have ever or whether we currently have repeat offender type provisions in our parking code or our parking rules, because if it's really the case that there's a handful of people who are spoiling it for everyone, I wonder if in escalating enforcement with the problem children is a better way to handle it.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Sanchez and Bajan, both great points. And I guess if I understand the question correctly, is it a couple bad apples that spoil the bunch? I would say yes. There's definitely some repeat offenders. We do cite people multiple times in all walks of parking. What I would say is that we've taken a good step in the right direction, but I think we could probably do some more. I think a lot of my team, the parking officers, are not equipped to go knock on the door of an RV in a lot of situations. So most of the time those contacts are done by police. I think they've done a really good job of educating those folks. But I think we could probably find another balance and also keep those things in mind, but also gain compliance and address some of these vast number of complaints that we're getting. So I think a little bit more tweak to this code could definitely accomplish all these goals.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I guess my concern is not for the businesses. They get a pretty good break when it comes to tax assessment and commercial buildings. So my concern is for people who don't have housing. Thank you.
I think I'm gonna pick up on a couple of things here, because you're right. Tyler's the parking person, and so it makes sense that you brought this today for the update, because we were hearing from folks that we needed to address the time and manner in which people could park. But as Tyler said in the beginning of his presentation, we also moved the abandoned vehicles and some of that parking enforcement to the police department for a reason. And Councilmember, I appreciate that you've pointed out that there have been fewer tickets issued. It was interesting to see that. What I would like to hear is, as Tyler suggested, from the NCOs and the police team, some more of information. I think a work session on more information, understanding more the nature of the calls, the geography of the calls, and to see if there are trends there and determine whether or not there are other interventions that need to be made, and there are definitely geographies that folks are concerned about. We've heard from a constituent up on the bench about an area that continues to be a problem. There's an area downtown that continues to be a problem. And I believe that we can do this differently. We can address both people with compassion and the expectation that we hold folks accountable, but we've got to be able to point them in the direction of the services and support that they need while we are holding them accountable for the ordinances that we have in the books. And so I'd appreciate, and Christine and I have talked about this a little bit, having a deeper conversation about some of the other things that play in this, so that we don't necessarily take a step of saying we're going to make it 1,000 feet instead of 600, and it's 48 hours instead of 72. And then what we're seeing is just a little bit more movement, but still not addressing the root of the problem and being able to connect folks with the services they need in order to hold them accountable to the ordinances and rules that we want to create to protect everyone, to treat folks with dignity, protect and acknowledge that everyone in this community needs to be part of the solution. So I expect that this is something that we could bring back for a work session at the right time once some of more of the information has been pulled together, and our housing team and some folks in these areas where there tend to be more issues have come together also to talk about some solutions tied with accountability.
Madam Mayor, can I add one more line item to that work session?
Yeah.
If there's a couple, at least over, I forget the number, over 1,000, maybe 2,000 complaints, and BPD is primarily handling them, the administrative burden cost officer time that we are consuming on this parking thing in the BPD side would be helpful to know, because I know that's something that's on all of our minds as we look at policing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I've gone out in some ride-alongs with officers that are, knocking on the doors of the RVs and others and having conversations about what folks know. And it's time consuming. There's quite a bit of care that they offer to these folks, and recognizing the time that it takes and the costs. And then frankly, that they're all at this point doing so much beyond just policing. It could well be that we determine that there are additional services, interventions, or supports that we should build into some of this too.
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
on a similar thread to that, Tyler, I know that you are a very, very busy person, and I know that code enforcement increasingly has a larger workload. Every time we pass an ordinance, every time somebody else moves to the city, as our population grows, the demand on code enforcement grows as well. So I think that that would be a really great thing to add to work session 2 is how our staffing is in code compliance and what your all workload looks like and if that needs to be adjusted.
Anything else?
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
just to piggyback on Council Pro Tem, just to say thank you to code compliance. You know, we often hear from folks different complaints, and I received one about a property that had a lot of stuff, and I reached out, and whoever it was that reported did a wonderful job, heard back from the constituent and said, you guys have a great code compliance team. So just passing that along from a grateful constituent. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Good to see you.
Thanks, you too.
Next up, we've got Jessica. Let's talk about the library.
Madam Mayor, members of council, following Tim's presentation on micromobility, I feel like I need to start with a disclaimer that my broken wrist was not an e-assist device, and it was entirely me on my bicycle attempting a hill or attempting a ride in the foothills that was beyond my capacity.
Oh my goodness.
I had assumed it was a reading injury.
And the second question, I was definitely wearing a helmet. So when helmets were mentioned in your previous discussion, I went out and bought 2 new ones because of that. So just wanted to point that out. And I want to thank you. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you and to share with you some of the work that we have been doing with our library strategic plan. To thank you both for your support, and then to thank members here who have been interviewed or who, in the case of Councilmember Halliburton, serve on our steering committee that have really helped us. And while it's me before you, this has really been a group effort with a lot of involvement from our community engagement team. And then obviously the consultant support where we brought in an outside expert in libraries that could really help us with some of the data analysis and really some of the peer benchmarking. So really for today's goals, it's daunting to try to summarize the last 6 months of this work that we have done, but really want to give you where we are in the strategic planning process. I think this is a great opportunity to highlight some of the work we've done, and particularly to preview some of those next steps. And I want to start with this anchor slide and a disclosure. This is not our strategic plan. This is not where we are in the process. This is us having done a great deal of community and partner listening. And so I want you to really see that where we are. I call this our anchor slide because we use it in all of our staff meetings, all of our steering committee meetings, our board meetings. This outlines what we're trying to do in this process, and it starts with listening first. The role of libraries is changing, the community of Boise is changing, and so we really want to make sure we're hearing from the community. I've heard a lot about the failed Maine library project and the key takeaway on that, and there's lots of different lessons in that, but what I've heard repeatedly is we want to be involved in understanding how the library as a system serves our needs in a community and how we are maximizing our resources. So those outcome goals, a library that is outwardly focused, has a positive impact for the community, and an entire system aligned to maximize our value has really been our driving force. As you know, we've talked about COVID, we've talked about growth, and the role of libraries changing, and those are pieces that were really important. And so when I had discussions with the Library Board of Trustees, they were very clear: take the time to do this right. Take the time to really deeply listening and make sure that everybody has a chance to participate and we're able to reflect back what we've heard. So that's why I talk about where we are in our project timeline. We kicked it off this spring. We started with deep staff listening. That is our most valuable resource. That's the people who know the community the best. Then we moved into some partner engagement. In the summer, we continued that partner engagement, but really led into that public engagement. How we did our survey, how we did our listening sessions, how we were out in the community. As I mentioned, some of the peer benchmarking. And so here we are in the fall of 2022, and we're going into that analysis and summary development. These are our findings. These are what it means to us. So that then when we build our strategic plan, the library and you and our community have real confidence in how that plan was put together and how it reflects what we have heard from the community. So let me talk a little bit more about our engagement approach. We have three, what we saw, sort of our key stakeholders. I mentioned staff earlier. This was really important to have our staff who work with our community every day start that process. So we did a staff survey before we did a community survey. We had 80% of our staff do that survey with us. We asked staff to do those community listening sessions. So we did staff listening sessions first so that we could practice what we wanted to do with our community. Then obviously our community is our largest stakeholder, but then also some key partners that I'll speak to as well. So here is the fun that we had listening to the community this summer. And I hope you got a chance to see some of this in action. We had, we had ways of capturing people that came into our buildings and also ways of trying to reach people who weren't coming into our buildings. So at all locations, we had what we call intercept or passive activities, where when you walked in, we would have a question and we'd want you to answer that question, but we would also use it. You can see maybe the QR code at the bottom. Hey, if you're interested in providing us feedback, here's a link to our survey. We did tabling at community events. Like I mentioned, we wanted to be where people were. So we were able to go to concerts at Lost Grove, the Boise Farmers Market, First Thursday at City Hall, like really wanting to be where people were. And we were able to have interactions with a lot of people in those. Then we also did in-person and virtual listening sessions where we got to have more in-depth discussions with the community. And then our community survey, which will have a lot more detail on that. That to us was just a really important way of hearing from the community. And we were pleased by how many responses we've got and what those represent. So as you see here, here's a shot of our one of our staff members. This is Gates Marquez, who works at the Hillcrest branch, and they are leading a community discussion. That we had a focus of 3 areas sort of in those discussions. Where does the library excel? Where can we improve? How can we help create the best future for Boise? And what role can the library play in making improving your quality of life? So those were really substantive feedback discussions. We heard how much people like their neighborhood branches, how much they like the staff that they know, and the fact that we have Gates here who knows the people in that community was having that discussion. I think that was really important. We also heard a lot about how the library can do better at outreach and partnerships, and particularly some people's challenging us, like, how can you be more visible? How can you be more in the community where we want to see you? And then also, because of those place-based discussions, we also had some really interesting feedback on, how can the library provide a role in providing a place for community discussion and a place for the community together to tackle challenges. The community survey we had open July to the end of August. We ended up extending it based on feedback. Hey, this is the summer and people are really busy. I think if you open it longer, like past when school starts, you'll get a higher response rate. That was absolutely great feedback. Our CE team also was tracking where we were getting responses from and did some targeted advertisement in certain zip codes where we didn't have as high a response rate as we wanted. So we wanted to really have a great sample size so that we could have real substantive feedback on what are we doing well, what we can improve, what does the community want us to prioritize, and how can we be relevant to more community members. It was by far the largest public survey the library has ever done. It was 22 questions on vision, usage. It had 11 open-ended questions, 12 demographic questions. It was a real investment of time. And I cannot thank the community enough for the feedback that they provided us. I want to thank everyone who took this survey. We're also still working through it. We have more than 9,000 open-ended survey responses, which I think shows the level of engagement that we got. And that is a piece of analytical work that continues. So I want to move on to sort of, well, who took this survey and what did they tell us? So when I start with who took the survey, one thing that was really important to us was to be able to identify who took the survey, and then what percentage of the Boise population does that represent? Because we were really wanted to be thoughtful about where we might have under or over representation. So in this graph, you'll see we broke this down by zip code, and you can see what percentage of people identified that they live in that zip code. That's the darker purple, and the lighter purple is actually the city average. So like I said, we wanted to know where we would have overrepresentation and underrepresentation. And we were able to talk to CE about this because there are places where, City of Boise surveys happen to have overrepresentation. Library surveys have overrepresentation. So this is where I said, like, we were watching some of those zip codes really closely to see, like, hey, how do we make sure that we get enough so that overall we've got confidence in our survey sample. But like I said, we had a great response from our public. Another question that we really wanted to focus on is, are we getting, where do people go, and how do we make sure that that sort of matches where we see people walking in our doors as well? So as you know, the downtown library is our largest location. It has the highest use. We expected that. A couple of things that I want to point out that are kind of interesting. The sort of tan bar is people who filled out our survey that reported that they use another library. And there's a really interesting geographic element in that. For instance, you can be a City of Boise resident, but you're actually you go to two of the Ada community libraries, and then Garden City. And because we're part of a consortium, we expected to see that. I think the fact that that's a larger bar, I think if we had broken that out by actual locations and we would see those smaller and individual, but that just sort of leaps out at me, and I wanted to explain why we thought that was important. The other one that
I also, sorry to interrupt, would be interested in, I know that the main library gets the most use, but if we looked at total usage, not counting the outside the system, but if we looked at total usage and like, I don't know if you do it by individual visits or what it is for a system, would these numbers be
would we
similar?
have the same?
Just like the zip code piece of what it reflects of the population and what percentage of the sample that zip code was within the survey? Is there a way to look at this in the same way?
Madam Mayor, I don't have a slide for that, but we can follow up on that. Because you're right. We were trying to look at, are there places where it is over or under? And we should be able to, we also have that data in terms of usage.
I'd love to see that, just to know for future, as we take in the next steps, just to understand the level of engagement and users based on library, if there are other things we ought to be doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Mayor. One other one that I'd really like to call your attention to, because this I think has been very interesting to have internal discussions. Just above the use in other libraries, so that's a fuchsia-ish color, the online only. So that we have a 5% of our users that reported that they only use our library online. So these are the people that have moved entirely digital. And when I move to the next slide, what's interesting about this is frequency of use. So we ask people, how often do you use a library? How often have you visited the Boise Public Library? So in-person visits, sort of the highest bar is that monthly, but online only, that is our highest percentage of people who are using our digital resources, and they report a much higher percentage of daily or weekly. And I think what's interesting about that is that's got really interesting implications for how we work with IT on our website. People that come in through that, what I call our sixth branch, they come in more frequently. So we should think about their usage patterns differently. I think it's, at first I thought that was counterintuitive, but then again, if your phone is your library, you're using our app, you're checking out a book, you're putting on a hold, that usage, I think we're seeing some of the changes of what people expect in our websites and what they expect in our physical locations versus online. So then now that we start to think about how people, we know a little bit more about what the people we know are filled out our survey and how they use it. Now I want to talk a little bit more about what they told us about how they use the library and what they see the library's role in the community is. And this is the first one where we asked people to look at some of our statements that are really built on the library's mission and values. And I just want to call out the top three, because I think the top three: supporting early childhood literacy and education and lifelong learning in a community, enhancing the quality of life, and providing universal access to information for all members of the community. You see overwhelming support for that role. And this is really, for us, exciting. This is what we do every day. And this is why we have chosen the profession that we've chosen. And so to see the community reinforce that, I think was just really gratifying, and also, shows, okay, we are providing a real important role. We also asked people to rate our current services. And this is one that I want to call out because this is, I think, a real indicator of us coming out of COVID. Curbside pickup, which is the highest ranked as an excellent service to users, was not something that we had pre-COVID at all locations. We had it in a couple locations, but with COVID, that pivot to make curbside available was, overwhelmingly positive. And I think what's interesting is that, that convenience is, to me, the piece that really stands through. Like, how are we making sure that we are providing access to materials? The other thing I want to call out is how low in comparison is our programming, particularly programming for teens, children, adults. This is one of those places where we know people, we heard childhood education, we heard, we want lifelong learning. I think that's lower, quite frankly, because during COVID, we weren't doing in-person programming, and we haven't been able to, we haven't had that back as long and as at the volume we had pre-COVID. So this is one of those things that I think you see that COVID switch. This doesn't mean we're going to have curbside, this doesn't mean we're going to double down on curbside, because we've got that really well, but we're going to see, hey, how do we bring up some of that programming, which I think really would have been higher pre-COVID.
So question on that. Was there a place for people to give feedback on, what they wish we We had.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And some of that is in, some of that was in sort of questions where you had to select, like prioritizing, and some of it is in the open-ended. So I'll
Okay.
get to some of that. So then another question that we asked, so really building on that, that role for us in the quality of life, where is the library's highest and best use? What should our role be in some of those things that lead to a quality of life? So again, access to education, we are having a lead role. The community clearly sees the importance of a library having a lead role. And when you think about sort of how libraries have really focused on kindergarten readiness and every child ready to read, I think that's a reflection in that. I think what's also interesting is that then you see where we have a much larger percentage saying that you should have a large or a small or even no role. And to me, what's really interesting in this slide is how there's never a majority of these issues where people say the library should have no role. But there are very clear places where we should be a supporting role. That allows us to really focus on how do we provide resources, how do we provide support, how do we convene. We think that there's a real role for the library, not as a leader, but is in enabling others. And I think that this is really indicative of this. And then I think one thing else that I'll call out, as you know, we recently added a mental health coordinator. And what was very interesting as we're going through some of the open-ended questions is having, the community, having comments from the community saying, this is outside the scope of a traditional library. We'd like the library to focus on, literature and literacy. And then we have a lot of comments saying, this is an incredibly important resource to help meet the needs of the community. And so this is why having that mental health line was so important for us to see, where are we as a community as a whole, and that piece about, yep, we're supporting, and I think we've got that mental health coordinator role in a support function in a way that I think that meets public expectations.
Madam Mayor, thank you. So Jessica, when you showed us the list of zip codes that participated in the survey, and we saw the overrepresentation of certain neighborhoods, does that figure into, here we've got at the bottom, where we've got folks thinking that the library shouldn't play a very strong role in affordable housing, affordable and quality childcare, those sorts of things. Do you think that's part of why we're seeing those types of responses?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Sanchez, let's hold that question. I want to talk about how we approached the demographics or how we approached the underrepresented part, because I'm not sure I'll answer your question, so we can come back to it, but I do have some thoughts on that coming forward. And then, one of the things that I think was really important for us was to understand, well, how well does the community think Boise Public Library is doing in serving our community overall? And, in some ways, this is our report card. As you can see, very well and pretty well, we're 85%, okay, 10%. The not well and I don't know are places where we really have, this is why we put in a lot of those open-ended questions. If we're not meeting your need, tell us why not. And so we're doing that work to really dive into that. And then we also are spending a lot of time on if you're not currently using our library, why not? What prevents or discourages you? This to us is, also that bit of, we want our resources to be as useful and used by the community as possible. And so here are some of the ways that people told us things that prevented or discouraged them from using our location. They're not convenient. I don't have a need for library services. Hours is not convenient. I'm not interested in the materials that you have. I don't know what's available or how to use it. I don't feel welcome in the library and it takes too long to get materials. These are things that we've all, need to dig into. We take them seriously, and this is why we had those open-ended questions, because we want to make sure that we are intentional about making sure that when we can address these issues, that we are. And as Councilmember Sanchez said, one of the things that we really wanted to do was think about how we get non-users. How do we understand who isn't using the library and how we can reach them and make sure that we're meeting their needs? So one of the things we wanted to do is really activate our partners and really make sure that we were hearing from the people who work with community members and serve the public in different ways, what they can help us understand. We asked our consultants to do interviews with the city and library leadership and city departments and key partners. To us, it was really important that we had an honest conversation that would be really sort of brutally honest, like where we were stepping up and where we were not. So we wanted to make sure that that gave people the opportunity to provide us an anonymous feedback. The community organizations, because those are organizations based here, we wanted those relationships. So staff did those interviews because we use this as an opportunity to build long-term partnerships. So you'll see here, lots of thanks to my colleagues, every department director that I said I would like, someone on your team to help us really see opportunities for engagement were here. What the takeaways that we got from that: huge appreciation for library staff and what they do and how they serve the public. Hearing from different parts of the city that actually refer, people have questions where they get referred to the library because they know that we'll be able to answer questions. A recognition that we are an organization in transition, both the city and the library. And then we really had a call to collaborate and partner in new ways. That the issues that the city of Boise is facing can't be handled by one organization alone. It really does require all of us to be at the table together, which I thought was a great message. And then that community organization piece. So this is how we are approaching some of those non-users from demographic groups that we thought that we knew were underrepresented and that we want to really make sure that we're serving well. So and this is an ongoing piece. We did outreach to about 20 different organizations. We've done interviews with 14 of them. You see education, right there. But also, how do we make sure we're serving the small business community? How do we reach renters or low-income housing residents, immigrants, refugees, English learners? This was a really positive place for us. To either reinforce partnerships that we already had or to build partnerships with new organizations. And, a tip of the hat to Kate Nelson and the mayor's office, who really helped us make sure we were reaching out to the right team on this.
Madam Mayor. Thank you, Director. I would like to add another organization in the education, and that's the West Ada School District, because there's 2 school districts that incorporated in the city of Boise. It's not just Boise School District. So I think we need to make sure that there's another school district represented there.
Madam Mayor, thank you, thank you, Councilmember Willits. Yes, absolutely. West Ada is it's such an interesting, and we actually spend a lot of time with the Ada Community Library, which serves more of those students. But you're right, a student could be served by either library or either school district. So that's a very good point. Thank you.
Madam Mayor. Thank you, Director. While we're on this, I wonder if you thought about reaching out to the Small Business Development Center and also the Idaho Nonprofit Development Center. I think those would be 2 that would be pretty valuable. There's also a Women in Business Resource Center. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it counsels women who are trying to start businesses.
Madam Mayor, thank you, Council President Clegg. Yes, I only put the list of who we've reached out to, or actually who we've had a conversation with, but would love to have additional ideas, because I think the more that we can promote our resources, and quite frankly, that's one of the things that we learned in our some of the open-ended survey questions is like, oh, I think you should have this resource. And it's like, oh, we have that resource. There's a lot of work for us to do in helping people be more aware of what resources we have and helping them navigate and find them. And I think some of those places where we can use our convening power to help organizations connect. I think that, having the idea of thinking about different sectors and how we support them is really important to us.
Madam Mayor.
For just a second, I was just going to say the organization that the council president's talking about, I can't remember what it's called either, but it's led by Diane Bevan and it's connected with the Small Business Development Center. They're both SBA grantees. So the Small Business Development Center would be able to connect you with the Women's Business
Idaho Women's
Center.
Business Center is what it's called.
Oh, okay, great.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, thank you. So Jessica, when we were leading efforts for the 2020 census here at the city of Boise, we put together a list of what we call informal community leaders. So these are folks who probably wouldn't be associated with these wonderful organizations. We did partner with them as well, but these are folks who have just earned the trust of their community. They don't have any official titles. They're just that person that folks trust. And I hope community engagement still has that list. So, and if not, we can certainly talk to the consultant who led the work on those outreach efforts for the 2020 census. So,
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Sanchez, thank you. That's a great resource. We'll track that one down as well. So I just want to mention one other thing that is going to go into sort of the culmination of our phase 1 listening. And this is the work that we asked our consultant Burke to do, is to do some peer benchmarking with us to really help us understand how do we compare to peer libraries, and particularly where can we learn from other libraries that are doing really well in some of the areas that were identified. So the city has had a list of sort of peer cities, but some of those cities have a different library structure, so they don't match as a peer to us. Comparing a district library versus comparing a municipal library are very different. And so we asked Burke to really look at, okay, find us some peers and try to find some that are just a little bit further ahead of us in some cases in growth, or in services that they provide. And really what I'm excited about is these in-depth profiles that they did. Because one of the things when we have all this data and listing and we're trying to think about where we're going, having somebody say like, oh, Scottsdale really has the partnership with the school districts figured out. That's the model you want to look at. To me, that was just a really important input. Not just here's what we've heard from the community, use it to prioritize, but then we're going to help you actually identify where are the places that you can learn the most from. So as I mentioned, we are really coming to the culmination of that phase 1, and we're working to provide a comprehensive summary of all those inputs that pull that together and give us a really robust report about where Boise Public Library is right now. What is the community? How does the community value? How does the community want to use it? And where are some of the places that we see comparing it to peers, it's either above or below, and where it can grow. We're going to come back after that. This is when we actually draft the plan. So this is when we're going to come up with our 3 to 5 year priorities for the next 3 to 5 years. Spoiler alert, you'll see education in it, right? Like that is so clear that we're going to really make sure that we are focused on that lifelong learning and particularly early childhood and education support. That's going to be something that we're going to continue to engage with staff, partners, the public board, come back to you as city council of saying like, hey, here's what we heard and here's the direction that we're setting. And then we'll move into phase 3, where we're really going to have opportunities to put that plan in place, have some new initiatives that come out of it, really having that opportunity to step back and look at everything that, everything that the community shared with us in terms of their hopes and dreams for the library, and then our plan for how we achieve it. So with that, I would love to stand for questions.
Madam Mayor. Yes. Thank you for that, Jessica. It's great to get an update on where you all are. We use the library all the time, and my son loves to see his dollar amount ticking up every time on how much he saved by checking out his books at the library. So it's really fun. So on the phase 3, because I think one of the ways we got a little bit sideways last time we developed a strategic plan and went about implementing it is that it had a very long timeline for execution. I believe it was 20 years. By the end of that 20 years, Boise looked very different. We had a lot of folks who didn't feel connected to that initial strategic plan. And I think that we all saw the fallout from that. So have you considered that in the implementation schedule for this strategic plan?
Madam Mayor, thank you, Councilmember Woodings. We thought really carefully about that. The 20-year plan that you're referring to was actually a facilities plan.
Okay.
And you want to have your facilities plan longer just because of the time frame that it takes to do building stuff. As you can see, this is why we now have Public Works helping us manage our buildings, and not me. But what's important in that is that the strategy, like what are the programs and services that should lead the facilities plan? What are we trying to do, and what does the city want us to do as a community organization? Then use that to say, okay, knowing the assets that we have, let's put together a plan that addresses, are there gaps in locations? What are ways that we could fill those? Is it we need another location here? Is it that we need, more lockers? Is it pop-up? We have a lot of potential. I want to really be clear from what the community wants in the programs and the services before we do that planning. But I expect we'll need to do that facilities planning shortly thereafter because of the growth of the city, because of the different buildings that we have and where they are in their life cycle. That will come next. But I think it's really important to lead with what's the library trying to achieve, and then think about what are the assets that help us do that, both physically and then also virtually.
Great. Thank you for that clarification.
Well, and then also I just say, Council President Pro Tem, that, that feedback is noted and important. So, for the record, for the library folks that might be here longer than we are, and knowing that when we move into that facilities plan, we should also be cognizant of the fact that it's 20 years is a long time. So if the final big project is at year 20, and we likely need to do continuous feedback and communication with the public throughout that plan, so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past.
Madam Mayor, thank you. So Jessica, there was a slide where you showed how folks are using the library, that there are folks who go to the physical location, and then there's folks who primarily use the online services. If you haven't already with this survey, are we going to take a deeper dive to look at what are people doing online when they access the library? We're going to look at that a little closer.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Sanchez, that's one of the things we're working with IT is to really understand that. That was a fascinating finding for me, and was fascinating for IT. And so one of the things that they've started doing is actually turning on their tracker of, okay, where do people go? What are they using? Just so we could get some more data on that, because it's so rich. And I would love to then know more about it, because it is, I refer to it as our 6th branch, and it is, probably our busiest location.
Thank you, Jessica. Just a quick follow-up, Madam Mayor. I really appreciate the questions about affordable housing, issues about, basic needs that people have. I think when folks are struggling, having to go to different locations to find information, to find resources, can be really demoralizing. And if folks are using the library to access job opportunities, housing, medical information, I think we should we should supply that. So we don't have people living in their cars. So we don't have people showing the signs of poverty that we don't want to see. I think we should absolutely support that. And I hope if that's what we see in the internet use, I'm hoping it will change folks' minds about the purpose of our library. And so thank you for that.
All right, we've got 2 final comments or questions. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Quick question. In your slides, I didn't see much open-ended questioning. And what is it we're not doing, like we weren't doing curbside service 3 years ago that people would like to see us doing? How are we getting that information?
Councilmember Clegg, could you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I missed the first part. You didn't see.
Open-ended question. What are we not doing today that people wish we were doing?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor, Council President Clegg. We will have that in our full report. That is a question that you really do need to answer open-ended. And like I said, we had more than 9,000 responses and we were a little overwhelmed. And so it's taking us longer to go through it, to be fair to everybody who, in some cases it's a one-word answer. And in some cases it's, 3 paragraphs, because we really want to do it well so that when we come back with that information, it has been read and analyzed.
Great, thank you.
Director, thank you so much. This is a treasure trove of information. I really like that you broke it out by zip code. I think that's great. I like that it was so comprehensive. I like the best practices. That it was interesting that it reflected some of my personal experience using the library, both during the pandemic, having books shipped to your house, amazing. And then also just the use of the county libraries because of where I've lived, there's not a Boise branch close. So you have to go to the county. And with that in mind, I'm really keen to see what the survey said about location. I understand the importance of services, but if you can't get to a location, the services aren't relevant because they're not close to you. And I think we've seen that there's a donut hole in some parts of our city, particularly in the West. And I'm interested to see how we're going to make sure that there's equal access to those services.
Madam Mayor, Councilman Willits, I really appreciate you saying that. That point about equal service, I think is so important. And I, in a survey that was about programs and services, the facilities need came in loud and clear. You saw it as a barrier. And so, this, I think it was why it was so important for us to do this is the community is telling us to move that conversation forward as quickly as possible.
Just one last thing, Madam Mayor.
If it's quick, because we're supposed to be in exec now.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for providing the multiple languages for folks to be able to participate in the survey. Thank you, Jessica.
Jessica, thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to your team as well.
Madam Mayor, I move that we go into executive session, personnel and land acquisition records exempt from public disclosure, pending and probable litigation, communicate with risk management regarding pending probable claims, labor contract, Idaho Code 74206 1B C D F I and J.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Clerk, will you call the roll?
Agent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Willits,
Yes.
Woodings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Thank you. We'll be back at 6.